think we'll make a start. There we go. Okay, so we've just done a brief introduction. So for anybody who's literally just joined, my name's Mags Pearson. I'm a senior consultant with DTP.
I'm Marcus Evans, senior consultant with DTP also.
So we're going to be talking about assurance frameworks. An assurance framework is a critical governance tool that can benefit boards, committees, councillors and executive teams to ensure that risks are effectively managed and that strategic objectives are being met. In this session, we'll outline an approach for the implementation of an effective assurance framework to strengthen governance arrangements. So Marcus is going to talk through definitions, purpose and the benefits of assurance frameworks and set the regulatory and the governance context. I'm then going to pick up the development steps, so developing the framework, before handing back to Marcus to run through suggestions on implementing and embedding the framework. And then hopefully we should have 20-25 minutes for Q&A. And just to say as well, we will send the slides, so don't worry too much about trying to make loads and loads of notes. So I'm going to hand over now to Marcus, who's going to take us through the first section.
Cheers, Max. Yeah, really important, and the importance of around having an assurance framework is to provide a structured and comprehensive approach for the board to ensure their strategic objectives are met, gaining assurance on risk management, support informed decision making, demonstrate good governance and oversight, and also promote accountability. So let's just spend a couple of minutes outlining the purpose and benefits behind implementing an assurance framework. See there, these definitions are based on the His Majesty now and Treasury guidance, but you'll find similar definitions across the internet if you do a search. There's absolutely loads out there, all called different terms in the sense of it depends on the organisation, but there's loads of variations and different terminology in use across traditional housing associations, local authorities and charities. But in today's session, we'll be referring to assurance frameworks rather than board assurance framework, just to keep it broad enough to relate to the different people who are joining us this morning. The key point whenever we're using the terminology is assurance, assurance as opposed to reassurance. And that's, being objective, independent and evidence-based from that terminology. As we go through the presentation, we'll talk about different types of assurance framework and the mapping exercises involved, but they're all about aiming to do the same thing, to provide an objective clarity on the strength of assurance that's in place. Okay, so assurance needs to be factual, really important, and documented. So the report provides assurance with verbally updates don't. That's important to remember. And this is where the importance of having a clear governance reporting structure in place to include clarity within terms of reference, roles and responsibilities, and define roles and responsibilities of board, cabinet, the committees, but also the leadership team as well throughout the governance structure. Remember, accountability can't be delegated. However, you can delegate providing source of assurance, but this needs to be clearly documented within a scheme of delegation. The mapping of sources of factual assurance is also really important in demonstrating the effectiveness of these arrangements. So remember, assurance, not reassurance. Okay, so here's the purpose of having an assurance framework. It's a simple one. Basically, ask yourself, how can you be assured that what you know is what you need to know, and with confidence? You need to satisfy yourself that you have reliable, accurate facts, figures, evidence, and that you use it to make informed decisions that you'll be held accountable for. Okay, next slide, Max. Provides a structured approach to identifying, assessing and mitigating risks, as well as mapping the assurance requirements across. And that's in relation to the controlled and management aspect of it in an effective way. Obviously, that's really important and helps board and management understand what the key risks are, how they're being managed, whether the controls in place are effective. And the key question to ask as part of any development and mapping out and assessing assurance as part of the framework are, is responsibility for each of the control assigned to someone? How do you know if the control is working effectively? Is it measured? Does the management check it on an ongoing basis, daily, weekly? When was it last independently checked as well? And what was the outcome from that? And were there any recommendations that needs to be actioned and implemented? And what is the source of assurance? Is it valid and is it independent? Okay, so just going to touch on the regulatory context now. Really important that, an effective assurance framework provides a clear audit trail of how the board or cabinet is discharging its responsibilities, which is especially important from a regulatory compliance point of view and stakeholder confidence as well. Okay, so just looking at the regulatory expectations, you'll all see this. There's the governance requirements of the regulatory standard, risk management and internal controls. Assurance is a specific requirement within the governance and financial viability standard. And the regulator requires all the RPs of social housing to maintain robust governance and assurance systems. And you should remember the key expectations are board accountability for ensuring compliance with consumer and economic standards, use of assurance framework. There's a terminology in there to monitor strategic risk, compliance and performance. Regularly self-assess and the use of internal audit to provide assurance on effectiveness of controls, and evidence-based decision making. So remember that factual evidence-based decision making supported by accurate data, not just data, accurate data, in relation to things like property conditions, tenant satisfaction, financial viability as well. And the purpose and intent of the framework is woven throughout the regulatory requirements, as you can see, and the expectations placed on governing bodies that can demonstrate that the organisation's taking its governance responsibilities seriously and is compliant with the legal and ethical standards also. Okay, so just looking at what do we mean by assurance based? Well, regulation is very much assurance based, and we've seen this through inspections and the outcomes. It's an important part of how the regulator regulates. Effective controls, robust oversight is critical, and the regulator will seek assurance that governance bodies, both boards and councillors and senior leaders, have this. And remember, inspection's not a forensic audit. That the regulator won't be testing operational evidence. They'll expect to see that governing bodies can gain sufficient oversight and assurance for themselves. Okay, we'll all probably have seen the regulatory casework review. If you've been on our webinar recently, you'll see the key themes that are coming out. But the regulator's explicitly clear about the requirements RPs have, that they have effective governance arrangements in place. And this requirement is no way diminished since the increased focus on consumer standards. In fact, the regulators pointed to the connection between consumer outcomes and compliance and the governance and compliance as well in recent regulatory judgments. And as I mentioned, we covered this, but if you look in the regulatory casework review published by the regulator, you'll see that we've woven throughout that. But also in the recent risk sector profile, if you've all had an opportunity to review that, it's mentioned throughout there. There's a clear read across from the consumer standards. Using an example, failure to ensure the health and safety of thousands of properties without valid gas safety certificates. That links back to governance and assurance in particular. What assurance did the RP board have that the data was comprehensive and reliable? So it does bring the effectiveness of the governance body under the spotlight. And that, the regulator will quite rightly question the effectiveness of governance arrangements where there is significant consumer failure. And if you look at that in the judgment to date, you can see the relevance across. Okay, so sorry, Max. We just touch on. Could you go back very quickly? Yeah, I won't stay on this slide too long. But this is further evidence where it was needed from the regulator's perspective and certainly on the importance of assurance. These are the direct quotes that have come out of the different regulatory judgments recently, and we just wanted to put that in there. And obviously, you'll have that to refer to back when you're looking at the slides. Okay, thanks, Max. I'm just going to cover now some of the wider governance requirements for context. Effective assurance framework is really important as part of the adopted code of governance from the NAFED. A lot of organisations use this as their code of governance. And you can see the NAFED code, one of its 4 key principles is aligned to this principle for control and assurance. But if you look at also the UK governance code, it's also relevant to that as well. This is taken directly from the 2025 version of the UK corporate governance code. But don't forget, of those organisations operate as registered charities as well. It's also within the Charities Code of Governance, which is recently being updated as well. And if, you know, to expect of the Charities Commission, they expect strong risk management also. Okay, so looking at some of the wider governance context, the assurance framework, it's got to align to strategic objectives and key risks and controls, helping the governing body focus on what matters most, the core purpose, through that golden thread, and ensures the governance body is not just reactive, but it's proactively managing risks that could ultimately derail the organisation and stop it from achieving its core purpose. So it's about getting your ducks in the right row, really. You know, you need to have implemented clear strategic thinking and determine strategic objectives, and to have understood the capacity to define risk appetite, and then identifying the associated risks and align the controls, and finally looked at gaining the assurance that those risks are controlled and they're working effectively. Those controls objectives are being delivered alongside delivering the day-to-day performance also. Okay, or to get an overview, where the assurance sits, this governance cycle here just shows it in layers: strategy, objectives, risk, controls, and assurance. Yeah, from that golden thread point of view. I just want to focus on the importance of the different levels of assurance. Next slide, please, Max. So this illustrates the pyramid of accountability, with board or cabinet at the pinnacle of that pyramid. And key to remember is that board or cabinet is responsible for setting and ensuring the RP fulfills its aims and objectives at the very top, and this includes ensuring robust approach to risk management. Detailed scrutiny of assurance arrangements can be delegated to audit, risk and assurance committees, but the board ultimately has responsibility for delivery of strategic purpose and compliance with those statutory and regulatory requirements. Therefore, you must have a framework in place to provide that assurance that the requirements are being met and risks are managed effectively. And the leadership team has a key role to play in that. That needs to support delivery of the strategic objectives, ensuring the day-to-day operations of controls are in place and adhered to and remain effective. Okay, so that's a lot of the background. I'm just going to hand over to Max now, who's going to go through how to develop an assurance framework.
So hi, thanks, Marcus. Before we get into this, I think it's just important as a bit of an overview to say that no one size fits all. The framework that you develop needs to relate to your objectives and the risks that are relevant to your organisation. And as we said at the start, the assurance framework will include various sources, and assurance mapping can take place at various levels. It's also important to agree what the scope is. So there's a lot of different factors to consider there, and we're going to talk through some of those points in the next few minutes. So Marcus talked about the hierarchy in terms of roles and responsibilities a minute ago, the triangle. So let's look at the hierarchy in terms of the components of the assurance framework. So starting at the bottom, these orange boxes, they show the different types of internal control. So some set direction and guidance, some are more direct controls. These are the day-to-day management controls that you'll have in place. In this middle section, you can see that the design and operation of the controls is tested and monitored at different levels with differing levels of assurance. So on this first level here, you've got routine management, performance reporting, self-assessments. This is really essential, critical stuff. It's timely, and it should be where any issues are identified, but it's not independent. So at the next level up, you've got checks, monitoring, validation that's done internally, but semi-independently. So for example, a business intelligence team analysing data, or a central team reporting on operational performance. At the third level, you've got the less frequent but more objective independent checks. So reviews, audits, more reliable assurance because it's independent and it's evidence-based, but it may be fairly infrequent, annual or even less often. And all of these levels of assurance and all of these sources of assurance make up the overall framework, and they may be part of an assurance mapping exercise that's then rolled up into a high-level assurance dashboard. So it's worth taking a minute just to look at the scope of assurance mapping. Lots of organisations are really good at mapping the sources of assurance in place to test controls in relation to strategic objectives, and there are some sophisticated, detailed assurance maps out there. Some are produced with the aid of risk management software, and they show the strength of assurance in relation to strategic risk controls, which is great, really, really useful, really important, but it's not necessarily the whole picture. So an organisation might want to create a process-focused assurance map, and that would mean methodically checking which controls are in place, what controls are in place across each business activity, and what level of assurance there is that those controls are working effectively. And that can be really invaluable in identifying gaps or weaknesses, which can then inform and shape the internal audit programme. It's also a really good mechanism for just establishing a bit of understanding, a bit of risk awareness amongst the operational teams. Now, board or cabinet doesn't necessarily need to see that level of detailed mapping. It's essentially a management tool, but it can be really useful for the audit or risk committee to see it on occasion for assurance that the work's been done and that it's influenced the internal audit plan. And then you have strategic assurance mapping, which can pull in the areas that are important to the governing body. So that might include strategic risk, performance against corporate objectives, or core regulatory compliance requirements. So this and the example on the next slide, this is an example of a headline summary of strategic assurance points. It's created on a simple spreadsheet or a Word document, and for many organisations, that simple approach works quite well. It obviously needs to be tailored to your organisation, so your strategic objectives. If you're a local authority, you'll remove governance and financial viability and value for money. But the point is to have a high-level, easy-to-read summary with space for accompanying narrative to provide clarity on any areas of weaker performance. So by exception, adding some commentary. And that might include confirmation of action, who are the owners, what are the target timescales, but by exception. So this is high level, this is dashboard level. This is just the second sheet of the same example. This type of dashboard view is not a replacement for detailed oversight. We just want to point that out. So you'd still be looking at the risk register or the health and safety compliance report, but it can give a broad overview. It can act as a can opener to then ask questions. Why is this red over here? What's this amber about? It can also mean that the risk register itself is less cluttered. So the risk register can be left to focus on risk description, risk controls, risk assessment without trying to shoehorn the assurance information in on top. Now, some organisations have done that really well, and they've got the detailed risk register with notes on controls and assurance, and particularly the ones that have got some software systems that help produce that in a neat way. It can work. But for others, it may be that you want a simpler summary, you want the assurance separated, and then you know where to drill in when you need. And for those of you that have got design teams or software that produces some decent reports, you might have something that looks more like this. But the point is the same. What's important is to agree what you want to have assurance on, and then to make sure you've got the reliable data and the easy to understand reports. So, 4 key steps then. The examples we've looked at show the summary level information, the dashboard of lights that say at a glance if things are okay or not. Underneath that, you'll probably have a more detailed assurance map, or maps plural. So let's have a look at how that might be devised. I'm going to walk through each of these 4 steps, but broadly the process will involve a first step of gathering understanding about the context for the organisation. Secondly, agreeing a methodology, so making sure everyone is on the same page about what the approach is going to be. Thirdly, developing the assurance map, and fourthly, assessing the levels of assurance. So to take each of those in turn, step 1, this is the starting point. This is the information gathering exercise. So you might look at strategic planning. What do we know about our objectives? What do we know about financial capacity? What do we know about key risks, etc., etc. I'm not going to go through all of that. But the point is to sit down and do that with the group that is going to do the assurance mapping, and figure out where do we want to focus attention? What do we already know? And that way everybody's on the same page and has a shared understanding of what's going to be delivered at the end. The second step then is the methodology. So agreeing the scope and the focus. So what is it that we want assurance on? Is it going to be a strategic overview? Is it going to be risk-based? Is it going to be down at process level? Is it going to be group-wide or one particular company or entity or a specific part of the business? So it's worth setting out and agreeing that. So you're not trying to boil the ocean in one go. And it might be that you start in one area and then develop it if that works for you. So also agreeing the level of detail to be captured. So how granular are you going to list every single source of assurance, all of the owners, the details of the last audit, any actions to be undertaken for each and every control in place? Are you then going to agree how much evidence is required? So are you going to allow any kind of subjectivity? So we talked about the importance of assurance versus reassurance, and that is definitely important. But when you first do this, you might find you're missing some of the hard evidence. So you're going to have to make a decision how much subjectivity is okay, and does it depend on risk appetite? So if risk appetite is averse or cautious, something like health and safety, you probably want some pretty hard evidence, or you'll just mark that as no, we don't have the assurance. Something where your risk appetite is a bit more fluid or a bit more open, you might say, yeah, okay, that feels reasonable. So feel rather than evidence. And lastly, managing expectations is really, really important. This kind of exercise takes a bit of time. It's not the couple of hours you spend in a workshop. It generates actions. It might lead to requests for more auditing or more scrutiny work, which might lead to requests for more budget. So knowing the scope, knowing what you're going to produce, and being clear that this is the workshop is the start, not the end, is really important. So this is an example of what a detailed map might look like that sits underneath the dashboard view. So in this example, strategic risk number 3, ineffective asset management, has got an overall assurance level of reasonable, and that's what you'd see on the dashboard view. Underpinning that, somebody has taken the trouble to say, right, these are all the individual controls, and this is how we're going to assess them. So we think that we've got reasonable assurance on the StockCon program, and we've got good assurance on all these other controls. And then you're logging, what's the basis of the assessment? Well, we've had an audit, or we know exactly where we're at on the StockCon program in numbers. When are we next reviewing it? We're logging all of those details. And if there's anything that needs an update, that's where the action goes in. So you might not need to provide a comment on everything, but you're recording where there's further action needed. And I mentioned subjectivity. There is some subjectivity here because in this example, the organisation has gone for overall assurance of reasonable. Now you might say, well, most of the controls, you've got good assurance, so why is it only reasonable? Well, that's because the StockCon program is such a major control. It's the most important control on this risk. So if that one is reasonable, then that kind of shapes your overall assurance level. So yeah, there is a bit of subjectivity involved, but the point is to get as much evidence as you can as the basis for your assessment. So the development stage then, workshop format can be really good for sharing understanding. I've used that quite successfully a number of times. It's useful because you can get peer challenge in there, you get the right people involved, and you get ideally a blend of authority. So the managers that know how things are supposed to work, the frontline staff that know how things really work, a bit of challenge is useful, different perspectives. So for example, if you were looking at, I don't know, development, for instance, you might say, well, let's get the development finance business partner around the table because their view of how controls are working might be different from the team's view. So getting the right people in, getting some challenge is useful. Explaining the purpose and benefits and using common language is ideal. So instead of talking about objectives, risks, controls, assurance, you'll be asking, what is it what's your job? What are you trying to achieve? What could go wrong? What are you doing about that? How do you know that's working? So you use those kind of words, and people tend to be a bit more engaged. Giving an example of the end output is useful so that you can make sure there's agreement and shared understanding about what it is you're producing, and agreeing who's going to look after the assurance map afterwards is really important because, as we've said, it will be updated. It needs to be kept up to date. So knowing who's going to do that is important. We've talked a little bit about the assessment as we've gone through some of the examples, but it's important to know it's an iterative process. It may be slightly subjective at first, the first time around, some gaps, some don't knows, and it can be refined to increase objectivity in next iterations. So if you've got gaps, you might say, okay, well, this area needs to be in the internal audit plan. Then you get the audit done, and then you can go back and put a more objective assessment into the assurance map. It's really important to challenge what you're being told and ask for the evidence. So if you're facilitating the workshop, it's about not taking things at face value and asking managers, well, when did you last check and how do you know? It's also important to be clear about what's a direct control and what's assurance. So for example, quarterly reports, I would say probably not frequent enough to be direct controls. Important, but not a direct control. And avoid making assumptions about how effective a control is. Ask that, well, how do you know question often, and again, how do you know, really, how do you know? And again, agreeing the outcomes for the assessment is important, so you know what it is that you're aiming at and you've got that shared agreement. So I'm going to hand back to Marcus now, who's just going to go through a couple of steps on implementation and embedding.
Cheers, Max. Really good. Yeah, and just finally now, just want to run through some key points you'll need to consider when implementing an assurance framework. So looking at the must-dos and the must-not-dos, the really important aspects of it, all of which from our experiences of working with and supporting organisations in the development, we've gathered all these examples. Really important for the implementation of the framework. So just touching on the developing the framework, okay, to recap, is a checklist. We've covered most of the detail during the webinar, but we do recommend that this is used by any project team or task and finish group when agreeing your approach to developing the assurance framework, having those identification of the key components and agreed terminology, and the scope is really important. They're the most important aspects of it when setting that up, is the scope of what you're actually going to cover. Understanding having a clear end goal as well on the mapping as well relates back to strategic objectives, as we mentioned throughout the presentation, is really important. Be upfront and reflect on it as well, and obviously the challenges, scrutinise it, get third parties to look at it and scrutinise your approach, but really important that you document and that process and the approach that you're going to undertake. Obviously identify what your key goals are. So what are the benefits are, what's the to get there, and that'll allow you to help get that buy-in, which is really important. But when you're developing it as part of a project, or as I said, part of a task and finish group, which we recommend, it's about having the right people in the room, the ones who are actually doing the representation from the board, the committees, and the senior management team as well, those involved in risk management, those involved in the governance arrangements. You've got to make sure everyone's involved and agree a set of terminology as well, but try and avoid the jargon. It's so easy to get lost in the jargon at times. Simplify it, just keep it nice and simple, tell it as it is, but agree on that map or dashboard that's going to be used going forward. That's the most important part, because that's the view that you'll use. That's the window into your assurance. Okay, so just looking at some of the implementation issues, here's some of the pitfalls, the key pitfalls with evidence whilst working with organisations, and these are the lessons learned. It needs to have clear ownership and accountability at the highest level, and sitting within the governance bodies. It needs to be based on accurate, reliable, validated data. Rely on specific factual evidence at the right level of detail to provide assurance. Don't summarise everything. If you look at the example there, 97% of health and safety targets are green. What is that telling you? What assurance is that telling you? You could look upon it and say, well, what about the 3%? That doesn't give me much assurance. So it's understanding the detail that sits behind it. So rely on specific factual evidence at the right level, and just agree a format that works as well. It's really important, and that's all part of that implementation process, the level of assurance that you need and the evidence that you're going to use, and getting everyone to buy into that. What's really important is embedding the framework, which is key. And just the next slide, please, Max. Brilliant. Cheers. Um, this is about sustaining a culture of providing and gaining assurance. So you've implemented it, you've done all your developments, you've got it in there, but you know, we don't want it falling off after the next 5 minutes. It's about embedding it. When working with clients, we advise, you know, document the purpose and the approach. So we clearly identify the reason behind and the benefits around that framework that's in place. Most importantly, you require ongoing activity for it to remain effective. You know, it's got to become part of the everyday assessment of assurance, not just something that you're going to pull out, you know, and review once a year. You know, so from the point of view of like utilising your horizon scanning, you know, looking at the publications from the register as well, risk registers, and stuff that's coming out from the regulatory, you know, spectrum, but also, you know, accurate and up-to-date assets and liabilities register, how you're using that to make decisions and assessing that as well. You know, your interactive stress testing sessions with the board and your recovery plans as part of those controls. Utilising internal audit as well, as part of the test controls, and other sources of assurance as well. Independent assurance, really important. You know, keep it simple with regards to flagging the key issues. So early warning indicators on, you know, on performance reporting as well, just to trigger any issues for you to look into more detail, and then that will enable you to deep dive into some of those issues as well, and some of the effectiveness of some of the assurance arrangements as well. You know, test that on an ongoing basis. You know, look at the key risks and do those deep dives on those areas. But don't forget regularly reporting to your governing body and to provide them with the assurance they need. That's the most important embedment part of it, keeping it on the radar at all times. Okay, so we've taken up to 35 minutes just to go through the presentation. So that's the end of the presentation. But just before we pick up any questions that are being posted in the chat, hopefully you found it useful and informative, the webinar. If you'd like to discuss any aspects of what we've covered today and how DTP can assist you in either developing an effective framework or simply supporting you in a review of your existing framework, if you've already got one in place, our contact details are at the end of the slide, which we'll share later on, either later today or tomorrow. There's already a couple of questions in there around the slides and the recordings. Yeah, we are recording this session. Like we do with all our webinars, we will provide the slides to all those who will be in attendance. We'll email that out in the next day or so. And we'll also post the recording as well on YouTube, and we'll have links on LinkedIn, so you'll be able to access it. And we'll include the link in the email as well to you. Okay, so just picking up on some of the questions. That was one of the questions that came up. Let's see if there's
a good question there from well, the first one that I can see. Yeah. The first question I can see there is from Julie, around on the assessment of controls, so reasonable or good, for example. Would you agree that with board or committee rather than exec? For me, I you know, come into this as well, Marcus, but for me, this is where Audit and Risk Committee can really come into its own. So I think it's a good point. I would probably develop the methodology, you know, with advice from a consultant and certainly with execs agreement, and then I would probably take it to Audit and Risk Committee and say, this is what we've done, and allow them to ask questions, to test it, to probe it, to challenge it, and gain assurance that they're happy with it, because they're then in a position to provide that assurance in turn to the board. So without the board sitting through all of the nitty-gritty about how the approach has been done, Audit and Risk Committee can see how that's been worked and then say to the board, yeah, we've seen this, we've tested it, we've challenged it, and we're happy with it.
Yeah, Max, it's similar to the internal audit, isn't it? Most of the reports will go through to Audit and Risk Committee for them to scrutinise and undertake any further deep dives and scrutiny of it before, you know, submitting through to the board to review the assessments and make sure they're happy with it ultimately. But yeah, utilise the committee definitely.
Yeah. So then Liz has asked, how frequently would you suggest iterating the map or the dashboard? Yeah, good question. So it depends a little bit on what you mean by that. For me, I think how often you update the underlying maps, I would say depends on how mature it is in the first place. So going through the process of saying, well, what's the level of assurance, and questioning it and updating it as you're getting better at, more comprehensive assurance. I think, as I say, it depends on how many gaps you've got in the first place. If you've got loads of gaps and you've got quite an active audit program because you're just starting out on this journey, then you probably want to update that dashboard maybe quarterly. I think in terms of what goes to the board, I think, yeah, having that dashboard as part of the regular board meeting, I think would be useful. Because it allows the board to get that oversight. And as I said, that's not a replacement for digging into the risk register or something like a health and safety report, but that regular dashboard could go to each board meeting. Do you agree with that, Marcus?
Yeah. When you think about it, most organisations use that platform now, that digital platform for submitting papers. I agree. I think it's really important that boards do have sight at each of the meetings, and certainly at least on a quarterly basis. With the additional information we can include in the, it doesn't have to be included all the detail in the board papers, but certainly there for board to reference, as you said, Matt. To dig a little bit further if they need to gain further assurance, but they should gain that from the actual, the map itself from the dashboard. That's the whole purpose behind it, isn't it?
I think so. I think that answers Vicky's question as well. But if any of these questions aren't properly answered, then do feel free to add another note in. Catherine's question on have you any recommendations when it comes to determining desired levels of assurance? That's a really good question. For me, it needs to relate back to risk appetite. So as I mentioned, you're going to want really robust, external, independent, objective assurance on something like health and safety, where your risk appetite is probably averse or cautious or minimal, whatever terminology you use. So I think there isn't a sort of a standard set of numbers that you would apply necessarily. I think it's about working through how it relates to risk appetite and what's important to you. How does it relate to strategic objectives, and what kind of assurance map it is that you're developing. It's something that you'd work on and agree that framework up front. But there isn't a sort of a ready out of the packet answer to that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's the different levels, Max, isn't it? It's just making sure that you just haven't got the one source of information and source of assurance that you're reliant on. You're looking upon it from those three lines of assurance, and utilising them, and I think, that's the best form of assurance. Different levels within each, but certainly, making sure you're picking up all those three levels.
And as I say, the higher the risk, the lower the risk appetite, the more assurance you're going to need.
Yeah.
So Jason's got a question about thoughts on how best to embed a primary contractor. That's a good one within the assurance framework. It depends what you mean by embedding. I think they're the sort of people who could be really good to get involved with a workshop. So when you're doing your assurance workshop to begin with, getting their view on how it works for them. But it probably depends on what kind of contractor you mean and how you want to get them embedded. And again, is this an assurance framework that is say you've got an assurance map that's trying to look at strategic risks? I would definitely get the contractor's view of risks related to the relevant risk, but they may or may not be involved in everything. So it depends a little bit on what you're getting at with that one, I think.
I think what you've got to be careful about there as well, Max, you've got to make sure, obviously, if you're reliant on third-party data as well, that's coming across from those contractors, that you're satisfied, you're happy with the level of data that's coming over. But you should be looking upon that as part of that contract management anyway. But yeah, you need to make sure that's totally reliable, accurate, and validated really before boards start relying on that information as such.
Yeah. Blind spots. So in our experience, are there any common blind spots that are easily missed in assurance frameworks? I think one of the things is the confusion that people get into with controls and assurance. So it's not so much whole areas that just don't get looked at other than the operation. I think quite often you get good assurance maps, but they're based on strategic risks. So if something isn't on the strategic risk register, it's not getting checked. And that's why I think it can be really, really useful to have an operational assurance map as well. So just digging into what's going on at the 3 lines, across the operations, because it's those things that can just sort of sneak up, and they might be operational, so they might not be being looked at all that much, but they have the potential to impact at a strategic level. So I think that's one area to be guarded about. And then, what I started off with saying there was about the blend between, or the confusion between, controls and assurance, because I think you do get quite a lot of, well, this is a control. Actually, no, it's just reporting on something which is useful for assurance, but it's not directly controlling the risk at source. So that's definitely something that people get a bit confused about. I don't know if, Marcus, if you've got any more that you can think of from your experience.
No, I can't think of any examples of that. It's like, it's about, the key risks are the ones that you're not aware of, aren't they, really, ultimately. But, working with the risk owners and those who are responsible for assessing risks on a regular basis as well, shouldn't have any blind spots. But I'll probably take Mag's point up there in the sense of when you're actually developing and you're pulling the framework together as part of that project group, or that task and finish group as I recommended, but having the right levels there. We've talked around, having people there from your governing body, certainly your committees, your audit committees there as well, and the leadership team. But having some operational staff as well, because they're the ones who are delivering on front line. And I think that's a real advantage to having that. They're the ones who are on the coalface and identify those issues that a number of small ones might all lead up to it, capitulating into a big risk, a big, materialization of a risk. So I think it's, from that point of view, is do that work, do that, consultation, collaboration work, and with all levels, because I think as well is it'll help with the embedding of it as well, and it'll just increase your oversight and understanding. So
yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, I've done process mapping exercises with people where the managers have been saying this, and this, and this is what happens. And they're basically telling you what's written in the policy or the procedure. And then they leave the room and operational teams will go, nah, that doesn't happen like that. We don't do it like that because it doesn't work. And this is the reality. So definitely getting that mix of hierarchy, like you said. And I think I mentioned getting somebody from outside of the team. So the teams that are on the receiving end of whatever the process is can be quite useful to get involved. I can't see any more questions in the chat. Does anybody go? Oh, there's one that's just come in from Guy. So before our balance scorecard goes to board, I review for any outliers, drill down into poor performance, question the explanations. That's good. This helps me be confident about the figures, that the figures are correct. This is part of my management role. Is this reassurance or assurance or just a control? Should board only rely on it if it's done by an external person? Okay, so firstly, I think those management checks, that QA sort of process, I think are really, really, really important. Nowhere in any of this are we suggesting that you do away with internal checks because they're not external. So they are really important and the board can take some reliance from them, but it's about layering it up. It's about knowing that that is happening. Because that's good, important challenge, and apart from anything else, that means that you as a manager know what's happening, and you've got trust in what your team are doing. So that is really, really important, that work. But it's about saying, well, periodically, can we get an external view of this? And how frequent that periodic external view is will probably depend on what level of risk is involved in your risk appetite again.
Great.
Okay. Any more for any more? Anybody want to raise their hand and say something? Because if not, we will say thank you to everybody for attending and draw it to a close. Any last comments? I can't see any of the little sort of dots that mean that somebody's typing.
No one's typing anything. Hopefully we've covered everything off during the course of the morning. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So just to reiterate then, Max, just from the point of view of, because I know it was mentioned a couple of times, is we will provide the presentation, the deck of slides through. We'll send that to all invitees only and those who are in attendance. And so you'll get a PDF version of that, so you can share it with anyone else in the organisation, as part of any meetings as well, which is really important. We want to share this knowledge and understanding, and also as well we'll include a link once we've looked at the record and make sure it's fit for purpose. We'll get the link put into the email as well, and then that'll go onto YouTube as the platform for showing it, and we'll publicize it as well on LinkedIn. So yeah, thanks for the comments, very useful, thank you very much. Yeah,
thanks everybody for giving up your lunchtime.